The smoke was so thick I could barely see my own hands as I stumbled through the burning warehouse. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer, but not close enough. My lungs burned with every breath, and the heat was unbearable. Behind me, I could hear Detective Hawkins shouting something, but the crackling flames drowned out his words. I had maybe 30 seconds before this whole place came down on our heads. 30 seconds to find what we'd been searching for all night. 30 seconds to prove that everything I'd discovered about the Union Pacific night train wasn't just the paranoid delusions of a washed-up railroad investigator. The wooden crate I was looking for had to be here somewhere. It had to be. Because if it wasn't, then 3 people had died for nothing, and the biggest cover-up in Denver's transportation history would stay buried forever. But let me back up. 3 days ago, I was just Jake Brennan, a guy who'd spent 15 years working insurance fraud cases for the railroad. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous. Just paperwork, interviews, and the occasional warehouse inspection. I was sitting in my cramped office above Murphy's Diner on Colfax Avenue, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and trying to make sense of a shipping discrepancy report. The morning sun was streaming through my dirty window, and the familiar sounds of Denver traffic were just starting to pick up outside. That's when Maggie O'Sullivan walked through my door. I'd known Maggie for about 2 years. She worked as a night shift supervisor at the Union Pacific Rail Yard, and we'd crossed paths on a few minor cases. She was tough, smart, and had this way of cutting through bureaucratic nonsense that I really respected. But that morning, she looked different, scared. "Jake," she said, closing the door behind her and checking over her shoulder. "I need your help with something, and I need you to promise me you'll keep this between us." I set down my coffee and gestured to the chair across from my desk. "What's going on, Maggie?" She sat down, but kept glancing toward the window. "There's a night train that's been coming through Denver every Tuesday for the past 6 months. Train number 4847. It's not on any official manifest. It's not in the system. But I've seen it with my own eyes." I leaned back in my chair. Ghost trains weren't unheard of in the railroad business. Sometimes paperwork got lost, or routes got temporarily changed without proper documentation. It could be a clerical error. Have you talked to dispatch? "That's just it," Maggie said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I did talk to dispatch. Tommy Kowalski told me there was no such train. Said I must have been seeing things. But Jake, I'm not crazy. I've been working that yard for 12 years. I know every train that comes through there." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital camera. So I started taking pictures. The photos she showed me were grainy and taken in low light, but they clearly showed a freight train with about 20 cars moving through the yard. The locomotive had Union Pacific markings, but something about it looked off. The cars were all the same type, sealed containers that you typically use for high-value cargo. "When does it come through?" I asked. "Every Tuesday around 2:30 a.m. It stops for about 10 minutes at the auxiliary loading dock. You know, the one they rarely use anymore. Then it continues east toward Kansas." I studied the photos more carefully. "Any idea what it's carrying?" Maggie shook her head. "That's what I want to find out. Jake, I've got a bad feeling about this. The way Tommy shut me down, the way some of the other supervisors have been acting weird lately, something's not right." I looked at her for a long moment. Maggie wasn't the type to chase shadows. If she said something was wrong, then something was probably wrong. "All right," I said finally. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to come with me Tuesday night. See it for yourself. Maybe with your investigative background, you'll notice something I'm missing." I agreed, and we set up a plan to meet at the rail yard at 2 a.m. the following Tuesday. Maggie would use her supervisor access to get us to a good vantage point where we could observe the mysterious train without being seen. After she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something much bigger than a simple paperwork error. But I'd been doing routine fraud investigations for so long that the prospect of a real mystery was actually exciting. Tuesday night came faster than I expected. The Union Pacific Rail Yard at 2 a.m. was a different world from the busy operation I was used to seeing during the day. A few security lights created pools of yellow illumination, but most of the massive facility was swallowed by darkness. Maggie met me at the east gate, and we made our way carefully through the maze of parked freight cars toward the auxiliary loading dock. She knew the yard like the back of her hand, leading us through passages between trains that I never would have found on my own. "There," she whispered, pointing to a concrete platform about 50 yards away. "That's where it stops." We positioned ourselves behind a maintenance shed with a clear view of the dock. At 2:28 a.m., I started to wonder if we were wasting our time. Then I heard it. The low rumble of a diesel engine echoed across the yard, and a single headlight appeared around the bend about half a mile to the west. As the train got closer, I could see that Maggie's photos hadn't done it justice. This wasn't just any freight train. The locomotive was newer than most of the equipment Union Pacific used for regular freight, and it moved with an almost eerie quiet efficiency. The 20 cars behind it were indeed identical dark green containers with no visible markings or identifying numbers. Just as Maggie had described, the train came to a stop with the middle cars positioned perfectly at the loading dock. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, as if on cue, doors opened on 3 of the containers, and figures in dark clothing began emerging. I counted 6 people total, all wearing what looked like tactical gear and moving with military precision. I raised the binoculars I brought and tried to get a better look at what they were doing. The team worked quickly and efficiently, unloading several large cases from the containers and loading them onto a waiting truck that had pulled up to the dock. "Jake," Maggie whispered urgently, "look at that truck." She was right to be concerned. The truck was completely unmarked. No license plates visible from our angle, no company logos, nothing to identify where it had come from or where it was going. The entire operation took exactly 8 minutes. The cases were loaded, the container doors were sealed again, and the figures disappeared back into the train. The truck drove away without turning on its headlights until it was well clear of the rail yard. At 2:41 a.m., the mysterious train continued its journey east, leaving no trace that it had ever been there except for some fresh tire tracks on the loading dock. Maggie and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes after the train disappeared. Whatever we had just witnessed, it definitely wasn't standard railroad operations. "Jake," Maggie said as we made our way back to the gate, "I've never seen anything like that. Those people moved like they were military or law enforcement." I had to agree. The precision, the timing, the unmarked vehicles, everything about what we'd seen suggested a highly organized operation that was definitely not supposed to be public knowledge. "We need to find out what was in those cases," I said. "We need to figure out where that truck went." Maggie nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Jake, what if we're getting into something dangerous? What if these people don't want to be discovered?" It was a valid concern, but I was already too invested to back down. "Then we'll be careful." "But Maggie, if something illegal is happening here, we have a responsibility to find out what it is." The next morning, I started my investigation in earnest. I began by checking Union Pacific's official schedules and manifests for any mention of train number 4847. As Maggie had said, there was no record of any such train in the system. I expanded my search to include other rail companies that use the Denver hub, thinking maybe the train belonged to BNSF or Kansas City Southern. Still nothing. Next, I started making calls to contacts I had at various shipping companies and logistics firms around Denver. I described the truck we'd seen and asked if anyone recognized the description or had heard rumors about unusual late-night cargo operations. Most of the calls were dead ends, but on my 7th try, I got lucky. Randy Hutchinson, a guy I knew who worked dispatch for a local trucking company, had some interesting information. "Jake, I don't know if this is connected to what you're looking for," Randy said, But about 3 months ago, one of our drivers mentioned seeing unmarked trucks making regular runs to a warehouse complex out in Commerce City. Said it looked like some kind of government operation, but real hush-hush. Randy gave me the address of the warehouse complex, an industrial area about 15 miles northeast of downtown Denver. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first real lead I'd found. I decided to drive out there and take a look around, even though I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. The Commerce City Warehouse Complex turned out to be one of those anonymous industrial parks that you see all over the Denver metro area. Dozens of identical buildings housing everything from auto parts distributors to furniture storage. I drove through the complex slowly, looking for anything that might connect to the mysterious night train operation. Most of the buildings were clearly marked with company names and had normal business activity during the day. But one building caught my attention. It was larger than the others, with fewer windows and what looked like enhanced security features. The only marking on it was a small sign that read Mile High Logistics, authorized personnel only. I parked across the street and watched the building for about an hour. During that time, I saw 3 different unmarked trucks come and go. Not exactly like the one from the rail yard, but similar enough to be interesting. The people I saw entering and leaving the building were dressed like business professionals, but something about their demeanor reminded me of the tactical team we'd observed at the rail yard. They moved with purpose and awareness that suggested they weren't just regular warehouse workers. I made notes of the license plates I could see and the times that vehicles arrived and departed. It wasn't much, but it was starting to form a pattern. That's when my phone rang. It was Maggie, and she sounded panicked. "Jake, you need to be careful," she said without preamble. "I think someone knows we were watching the train." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What happened?" This morning, Tommy Kowalski pulled me into his office and started asking weird questions about what I've been doing during my shifts. He wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual in the yard lately, if I'd been talking to anyone about railroad operations. "Did you tell him anything?" "No, of course not. But Jake, the way he was asking, it didn't feel like a routine check. It felt like he was fishing for something specific. Like he knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see." I started my car and pulled away from the Mile High Logistics building, checking my rearview mirror more frequently than usual. "Maggie, I want you to be extra careful at work. Don't do anything that might seem suspicious, and don't mention our investigation to anyone." "There's something else," Maggie said. "I did some checking in the personnel files. Tommy Kowalski has only been working at Union Pacific for 8 months. Before that, there's no record of where he worked." That was definitely suspicious. Union Pacific was usually pretty thorough about background checks, especially for supervisory positions. The fact that Tommy's work history was blank before 8 months ago was a red flag. "All right, listen," I said as I pulled up to my office. "I think we need to be more careful about how we investigate this. If someone is watching you at work, then they might be watching me too." We agreed to communicate only through secure channels and to avoid meeting in person unless absolutely necessary. The game had changed. What started as curiosity about an unusual train had become something much more serious. Over the next 2 days, I threw myself into researching everything I could find about Mile High Logistics, Tommy Kowalski, and any connections to unusual cargo operations in the Denver area. Mile High Logistics turned out to be a subsidiary of a larger company called Apex Strategic Solutions, which specialized in government contracting and logistics support. Their website was professional but vague, with lots of corporate speak about mission-critical operations and secure transport solutions. The more I dug, the more interesting it became. Apex Strategic Solutions had contracts with several federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. They were involved in everything from disaster relief logistics to sensitive material transport. Most of the contract details were redacted or classified, but I found enough information to confirm that they were definitely in the business of moving things that the government didn't want the public to know about. That's when I got a phone call that changed everything. "Hello? Mr. Brennan, my name is Agent Patterson with the Department of Homeland Security. I understand you've been asking questions about certain transportation operations in the Denver area. My first instinct was to hang up, but something told me to hear him out. I'm a railroad insurance investigator. It's my job to ask questions about transportation operations. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to be direct with you. You're investigating matters that involve national security. For your own safety and the safety of others, I strongly recommend that you discontinue your current line of inquiry. The threat was clear, but it only made me more determined to find out what was really going on. Agent Patterson, if what you're doing is legal and above board, then you shouldn't have any problem with a routine investigation. There was a long pause before he responded. Mr. Brennan, not everything the government does can be public knowledge. Sometimes, protecting national security requires a certain level of discretion. I hope you understand. I hung up the phone and immediately wrote down everything I could remember about the conversation. Agent Patterson, if that was even his real name, had just confirmed that the mysterious night train was indeed connected to some kind of government operation. But the question remained, was it a legitimate government operation or something more sinister? The fact that they were threatening me instead of simply explaining what they were doing suggested that it might be the latter. The next morning, I received a text message from Maggie. Found something important. Meet me at City Park by the lake. Come alone. City Park was about as public and safe as you could get in Denver, so I agreed to the meeting. I found Maggie sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, feeding ducks and trying to look casual. Jake, I found out what's in those containers, she said without preamble as I sat down next to her. How? She handed me a manila folder. Last night, I stayed late at work and went through Tommy's office after he left. I found shipping manifests hidden in a locked filing cabinet. The documents she'd found were unlike any shipping manifests I'd ever seen. Instead of normal cargo descriptions like automobile parts or consumer electronics, these manifests listed items with codes like Class A biological samples, restricted research materials, and hazardous waste Level 4 containment. Maggie, this looks like they're transporting biological weapons or chemical waste. This is way beyond what we thought we were dealing with. That's not all, she said. Look at the destination codes. The destinations weren't normal addresses. Instead, they were facility codes that corresponded to government installations in Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas. I recognized some of them from my research. They were military bases and research facilities. Jake, what if this isn't about transporting illegal materials? What if it's about transporting legal materials that the government doesn't want anyone to know about? It was a good point. The documents suggested that whatever was being transported was highly classified and potentially dangerous, but that didn't necessarily mean it was illegal. It could be legitimate government research that required secrecy for national security reasons. Either way, I said, we need more information before we decide what to do with this. If it's legitimate, then we don't want to interfere with national security operations. But if it's not? Maggie nodded, but I could see that she was having second thoughts about how deep we were getting into this investigation. Jake, maybe we should just turn this information over to the FBI or someone who can handle it properly. I thought about it, but something didn't feel right. The problem is, we don't know who we can trust. If this operation involves Homeland Security, then other federal agencies might already know about it. We could be handing our evidence to the very people who are covering it up. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in thought. The peaceful setting of City Park seemed surreal given the gravity of what we were discussing. That's when my phone buzzed with another text message. This one wasn't from Maggie. Stop digging or people will get hurt. This is your final warning. I showed the message to Maggie, and I watched the color drain from her face. Jake, they know we're here. They're watching us right now. We quickly gathered our things and separated, agreeing to avoid contact for at least 24 hours while we figured out our next move. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That night, I sat in my apartment going over everything we'd discovered. The shipping manifests, the government connections, the threats, it all pointed to something big. but I still didn't have enough concrete evidence to take to law enforcement or the media. I made a decision that I knew was risky. The next night was Tuesday, which meant the mysterious train would make its regular run. I was going to go back to the rail yard alone and try to get better documentation of what was being transported. This time, I prepared more thoroughly. I brought a camera with a telephoto lens, a digital voice recorder, and a small GPS tracker that I hoped to somehow attach to the mysterious truck. Tuesday night found me back at the Union Pacific Rail Yard, positioned in a different location that would give me a better view of the loading operation. I'd chosen a spot on top of a maintenance building that overlooked the auxiliary dock. At 2:30 a.m., right on schedule, the mysterious train appeared. But this time, something was different. Instead of the 6 people I'd seen before, there were at least 12 figures securing the area before the containers were opened. They moved in patterns that suggested military training, and several of them were carrying what looked like weapons. I started taking photos immediately, trying to capture as much detail as possible. The enhanced security suggested that tonight's cargo was either more valuable or more dangerous than usual. When the container doors opened, I could see that the interiors were climate-controlled and lined with specialized equipment. This wasn't just a cargo container, it was a mobile laboratory or containment facility. What came out next made my blood run cold. Several people in full hazmat suits emerged from the containers, carrying sealed cases that were clearly marked with biohazard symbols. I zoomed in with my camera and managed to capture clear images of the biohazard markings. Whatever was being transported, it was definitely biological in nature and potentially deadly. The truck that arrived to collect the cargo was different from the one I'd seen before. This one was clearly a specialized mobile containment unit designed for transporting hazardous biological materials. The loading operation proceeded with extreme caution. Each case was individually checked and secured before being loaded into the containment truck. The entire process took nearly 20 minutes, much longer than the previous operation I'd witnessed. I was so focused on documenting the operation that I didn't notice the footsteps on the roof behind me until it was too late. "Don't move," a voice said quietly. "Keep your hands where I can see them." I slowly turned around to find myself facing a man in tactical gear who was pointing a weapon at me. He was young, probably in his 20s, with the bearing of a military veteran. "This is Perimeter Team 2, he said into a radio. "I've got an unauthorized observer on the maintenance building, requesting instructions." The response came back immediately: "Detained for questioning. Transport to the facility." The guard confiscated my camera and equipment, then ordered me to climb down from the building. As we descended, I could see that the loading operation below had stopped, and several other security personnel were converging on our location. I was escorted away from the rail yard and into a waiting SUV. The mysterious train, meanwhile, had closed its containers and was already beginning to leave. Apparently, my discovery had forced them to cut short their operation. As we drove through the dark Denver streets, I tried to process what had just happened. I'd gotten the evidence I was looking for, but now I was in the custody of people who clearly didn't want that evidence to see the light of day. The SUV pulled up to what I recognized as the mile-high logistics building I'd surveilled earlier. Up close, it was even more imposing than it had appeared from across the street. High fences topped with razor wire, security cameras at every corner, and guards who moved with military precision. I was escorted through several security checkpoints, each more intimidating than the last. Biometric scanners, metal detectors, and what looked like chemical detection equipment. Whatever was happening in this building, they were taking security very seriously. Finally, I was brought to a sterile conference room where 2 men in expensive suits were waiting for me. The older of the two introduced himself as Director Walsh, and the younger man was apparently the Agent Patterson who had called me earlier. Director Walsh was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of authoritative presence that comes from years in government service. His eyes were calculating, and I got the impression that he was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation. Agent Patterson was younger, maybe late 30s, and seemed more aggressive than his superior. He had the look of someone who preferred action to diplomacy. "Mr. Brennan," Director Walsh said, opening a file folder that contained the photos from my confiscated camera, "you've stumbled into something that's far more complex than you realize." I tried to maintain my composure despite the situation. "If it's so complex, maybe you should explain it to me instead of threatening me and dragging me here against my will." Agent Patterson leaned forward aggressively, but Walsh held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to share something with you that's classified at the highest levels of government. I'm doing this because I believe you're a patriotic American who will understand the importance of what we're doing." Walsh's tone became more serious, taking on the cadence of a national security briefing. 3 years ago, our intelligence agencies discovered that several hostile foreign governments were developing biological weapons specifically designed to target the American population. These weapons are unlike anything we've faced before. Engineered viruses that could cause massive casualties if they were ever deployed. I listened carefully, trying to determine how much of what he was telling me was true and how much was designed to manipulate me into cooperation. "The operation you've been investigating is a joint task force between Homeland Security, the CDC, and the Department of Defense. We're transporting samples of these biological agents to secure research facilities where our scientists are developing countermeasures and vaccines." It was a plausible explanation, and it would certainly account for the secrecy and security measures I'd observed. But something about Walsh's presentation felt rehearsed, like he'd given this speech before. "If this is a legitimate government operation," I said, "then why isn't it being conducted through normal military channels? Why use a private rail line and civilian contractors?" Walsh and Patterson exchanged a quick glance before Walsh answered. "Because, Mr. Brennan, we've learned that some of our normal channels have been compromised. Foreign intelligence services have infiltrated parts of our government and military. The only way to ensure the security of this operation is to conduct it outside of traditional channels." It was possible, but it also sounded like the kind of story that could be used to justify almost any covert operation, legal or illegal. "Here's what I'm prepared to offer you," Walsh said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll bring you into the operation as a security consultant. We'll pay you well, and you'll have access to classified information that will allow you to verify everything I've told you. In exchange, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement and cease your independent investigation." It was tempting, but I'd been in the investigation business long enough to know that if something seemed too good to be true, it probably was. And if I refuse? Agent Patterson spoke up for the first time since I'd been brought to the room. "Then we'll have to consider you a security risk to a vital national security operation. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The threat was clear. Cooperate or face the consequences. But I'd already come too far to back down now, and my instincts told me that something wasn't right about their story. "I need some time to think about your offer," I said, standing up. "This is a big decision." Walsh nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "Of course. Agent Patterson will arrange for you to be taken home. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, we'll need an answer." As I was escorted out of the building, I tried to memorize as many details as possible about the facility's layout and security measures. If I was going to continue my investigation, I needed to know what I was up against. When I got back to my apartment, the first thing I did was check for signs that it had been searched. Nothing seemed obviously disturbed, but I had the feeling that professional searchers might not leave obvious traces. My phone rang, but the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Jake, thank God you're okay. I heard from someone at the yard that you were taken into custody last night." "I'm fine, but we need to assume our phones are being monitored. Where are you calling from?" "I bought a burner phone this morning. Jake, I'm scared. After you were taken last night, Tommy Kowalski called me at home and told me I was being transferred to a different shift. He said it was for operational efficiency, but I know it's because they want me away from the night operations." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. They were removing Maggie from her position because she'd seen too much and asked too many questions. "There's something else," Maggie continued. I went to work this morning to clean out my desk, and I overheard Tommy talking to someone on the phone. He was saying something about accelerating the timeline and moving to phase 2 ahead of schedule. That didn't sound good. If they were accelerating their timeline because of our investigation, it suggested that whatever they were planning was time-sensitive and potentially imminent. Maggie, I need to see you in person. There's too much to explain over the phone, even a secure one. Can you meet me somewhere public but private? We agreed to meet at the Denver Botanic Gardens the next morning. It would be public enough to be relatively safe, but with enough privacy for us to talk freely. I spent most of the night going over everything we've discovered. The biological materials, the government connections, the secrecy, the threats. It all pointed to something significant happening soon. But I still didn't have enough information to understand exactly what that something was. The next morning, I arrived at the Denver Botanic Gardens early and chose a spot near the Rose Garden where we could see anyone approaching from a distance. Maggie arrived about 10 minutes later, looking tired and stressed. "Jake, I think I'm being followed," she said as she sat down on the bench next to me. There was a car parked across from my apartment all night, and I saw the same car behind me on the way here. I looked around the gardens but didn't see anyone who seemed obviously out of place. But that didn't mean we weren't being watched by professionals. I quickly filled Maggie in on my experience at the Mile High Logistics Facility, including Director Walsh's explanation about biological weapons research and their offer to bring me into the operation. "Jake, that sounds like complete bullshit," Maggie said bluntly. "If this was really a legitimate government operation, they wouldn't need to threaten private citizens and conduct operations in secret. They could just classify the information and move it through official channels." I had to agree with her assessment. My thoughts exactly. I think they're using the national security angle to cover up something else entirely. Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out another set of documents. I managed to get these before I was transferred off the night shift. They're shipping schedules for the next 2 weeks. The documents showed that the mysterious train operations were going to increase dramatically over the next 2 weeks. Instead of once a week, they were planning to run the operation every other night, with larger quantities of materials being transported each time. One date in particular caught my attention. Next Friday night, there was a scheduled operation that was marked differently from the others. Instead of the usual destination codes, this one simply said, "Final Destination, Denver Metro." "Maggie, look at this," I said, pointing to the Friday entry. "This time, they're not shipping the materials out of Denver. They're bringing them here for local use." Maggie's face went pale as she realized the implications. "Jake, what if they're not researching biological weapons? What if they're planning to use them?" The pieces were starting to fall into place in a terrifying way. The secrecy, the threats, the acceleration of the timeline, and now materials being delivered locally instead of shipped to distant research facilities. "We need to get this information to someone who can stop whatever they're planning," I said. "But we need to be careful about who we trust." Maggie nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Jake, if we're right about this, then we're not just dealing with some corrupt government contractors. We're talking about people who might be planning a terrorist attack on our own city. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we were wrong, we might be interfering with a legitimate government operation. But if we were right, thousands of innocent people could die if we didn't act." We agreed that Maggie would go into hiding while I tried to find someone in law enforcement who could be trusted with this information. It was a long shot, but it was the only option we had left. That afternoon, I found myself standing outside the FBI's Denver field office, trying to work up the courage to walk inside. I knew that once I took this step, there would be no going back. I approached the reception desk and asked to speak with someone about a potential terrorist threat. The receptionist, probably used to dealing with conspiracy theorists and cranks, looked skeptical but agreed to have someone speak with me. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Agent Sarah McKenzie, a woman in her early 40s who had the professional demeanor of an experienced federal investigator. She listened patiently as I explained everything Maggie and I had discovered. Agent McKenzie reviewed the documents we'd collected and asked detailed questions about the timeline of events and the people involved. She was clearly taking the matter seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to make some calls to verify parts of your story," she said after reviewing everything. "If what you're telling me is accurate, then we have a very serious situation on our hands." While Agent McKenzie made her calls, I sat in the conference room trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. When she returned 30 minutes later, her expression was grave. "Mr. Brennan, I've confirmed that there is no legitimate government operation matching what you've described. Neither Homeland Security nor the CDC has any record of the activities you've witnessed." I felt a mixture of vindication and terror. We'd been right about the operation being illegitimate, but that meant we were dealing with something far more dangerous than government incompetence or overreach. "I'm forming a task force to investigate this immediately," Agent McKenzie continued. "We'll need you to provide detailed statements and assist with identifying the locations and individuals involved." I agreed to cooperate fully, but I expressed my concern for Maggie's safety. Agent McKenzie assured me that protective custody could be arranged if necessary. Over the next few hours, Agent McKenzie assembled a team of federal agents and began planning a surveillance operation to monitor the Friday night activities at both the rail yard and the Mile High Logistics facility. I was briefed on my role in the operation. If Director Walsh or Agent Patterson contacted me again, I would wear a wire and try to get them to reveal more details about their plans. Wednesday evening, FBI technicians came to my apartment to set up surveillance equipment and prepare me for wearing a wire. The technology was more sophisticated than I'd expected, nearly invisible recording devices and tracking equipment. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Director Walsh from the Mile High Logistics facility. "Mr. Brennan, have you had time to consider our offer?" Walsh asked. I followed the script the FBI had prepared for me. "I've thought about it, and I'm interested in learning more. Could we meet to discuss the details?" Walsh agreed to meet the next evening at a restaurant in downtown Denver. The timing made me nervous. It was less than 24 hours before their scheduled Friday night operation. The FBI spent the rest of the evening finalizing their plans and making sure all the surveillance equipment was working properly. I was fitted with recording devices that were virtually undetectable, even to professional security personnel. Thursday evening, I arrived at the restaurant early and was seated at a table where the FBI surveillance team would have clear sight lines and audio coverage. My nerves were on edge, but I tried to appear calm and interested in Walsh's proposition. Director Walsh arrived precisely on time, and I noticed that he took a moment to scan the restaurant before approaching my table. He was clearly trained in counter-surveillance techniques. "Mr. Brennan, I'm glad you decided to hear us out," Walsh said as he sat down in order to drink. "I think you'll find that working with us is much more rewarding than working against us." I played the part of someone who was interested but cautious. I'd like to know more about what exactly I'd be doing and what kind of compensation we're talking about. Walsh launched into a detailed explanation of how I would be brought into their organization as a logistics security consultant. The more he talked, the more obvious it became that their entire operation was a carefully constructed cover story. I pressed for more specific details about their upcoming operations, particularly the Friday night activities that Maggie had discovered in the shipping schedules. Walsh became more guarded when I asked about specific operations, but he did reveal something crucial. Friday night will be the culmination of 3 years of planning. After that, our work in Denver will be complete, and we'll be moving on to other cities. My blood ran cold. Other cities. This wasn't just about Denver. It was apparently part of a larger operation that would eventually spread to multiple locations. "So, Mr. Brennan, what's your decision? Are you with us or against us? Because after tomorrow night, it won't matter either way." I accepted his offer, shaking his hand and agreeing to report to the Mile High Logistics facility Friday afternoon for briefing and assignment. It was the only way to maintain my cover until the FBI could move against them. As I left the restaurant, I knew that the FBI surveillance team was following at a distance, but I also suspected that Walsh might have his own people watching me. The next 24 hours were going to be the most dangerous of my life. Early Friday morning, I was brought to a temporary FBI command center that had been set up in an office building near the Mile High Logistics facility. Agent McKenzie and her team had been working around the clock to understand the scope of the operation we were dealing with. The command center looked like something out of a movie, walls covered with photographs, documents, and diagrams showing the connections between various people and organizations involved in the conspiracy. Based on the intelligence we've gathered, Agent McKenzie addressed the assembled team. We believe we're dealing with a domestic terrorist organization that has infiltrated several government agencies and private contractors. She pointed to a map that showed multiple cities across the United States. Denver appears to be a test case. If their operation here is successful, they plan to expand to at least 12 other major metropolitan areas. The scope of what we were facing was overwhelming. This wasn't just a local threat, it was a coordinated attack on American cities that could potentially kill thousands of people. The biological agent they're planning to deploy is a modified strain of hemorrhagic fever virus, McKenzie continued. It's highly contagious and has a mortality rate of approximately 60% in untreated cases. The team spent the morning going over the plan for that evening. They would monitor my infiltration of the Mile High Logistics facility while simultaneously conducting raids on other locations connected to the conspiracy. I was fitted with additional surveillance equipment and given a crash course in what to look for once I was inside the facility. The plan was for me to gather as much intelligence as possible before the FBI moved in to stop the operation. Friday afternoon, I arrived at the Mile High Logistics facility for what was supposed to be my briefing as a new security consultant. The level of activity was noticeably higher than during my previous visit. People were moving with the urgency of a major operation about to commence. I was processed through the security checkpoints and given an access badge that allowed me into previously restricted areas of the facility. Agent Patterson met me at the final checkpoint and escorted me deeper into the building. What I saw inside the facility was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of a simple warehouse, it was a sophisticated laboratory and command center. Banks of computers monitored various systems, and personnel in lab coats worked with equipment that looked like it belonged in a CDC facility. Your job tonight will be to monitor the perimeter security while our team conducts the final phase of the operation, Patterson explained as he gave me a tour of the facility. In one section of the facility, I observed people in full hazmat suits working with sealed containers that matched the ones I'd seen being unloaded from the mysterious train. The biological agents were being processed and prepared for deployment. The command center featured a large map of Denver with numerous locations marked in red. I counted at least 20 different sites spread across the metropolitan area. The scale of the planned attack was staggering. They weren't targeting a single location. They were planning to simultaneously release biological agents at multiple sites across the city. Patterson showed me to a security monitoring station where I would supposedly be watching perimeter cameras during the operation. The position gave me a good view of the main laboratory area and the command center. Once I was alone at the security station, I activated the recording equipment the FBI had given me and began documenting everything I could see and hear. At 8 p.m., Director Walsh entered the command center and called for everyone's attention. The final phase of their operation was about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh announced, tonight we strike a blow for the future of America. The corrupt establishment that has sold out our country to foreign interests will finally face the consequences of their betrayal. It was becoming clear that this wasn't about foreign biological weapons or government research. This was a domestic terrorist organization that believed they were saving America by attacking American cities. Walsh continued his speech, explaining their twisted ideology. They believed that the current government was illegitimate and that only through catastrophic events could they create the conditions necessary for a real American government to emerge. At midnight tonight, our teams will begin simultaneous deployments at all target sites, Walsh announced. By morning, Denver will be in chaos. and the federal government will be forced to declare martial law. This will be the beginning of the end for the corrupt system. I realized that the FBI needed to move immediately. Waiting any longer would risk allowing the terrorists to begin their deployment of biological agents. I used a predetermined signal to alert the FBI surveillance team that the operation needed to begin immediately. The signal was designed to look like I was adjusting my security equipment, but it would trigger the FBI to move in. Within minutes of my signal, I could see FBI agents taking positions around the facility through the security cameras. Agent McKenzie had coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies to conduct simultaneous raids on all the terrorist sites. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The terrorists realized they were under attack and began implementing their emergency protocols. My cover was blown almost immediately. Patterson and several armed security personnel converged on my position at the security station. "You son of a bitch," Patterson snarled, drawing his weapon. "You've destroyed 3 years of planning." I backed away from the security station, trying to reach the area where I knew FBI agents were entering the building. The facility had become a war zone, with armed terrorists fighting federal agents throughout the complex. Through the chaos, I could see Director Walsh attempting to escape through a rear exit, carrying a briefcase that I assumed contained samples of the biological agents. I couldn't let him escape with those samples. If Walsh got away, he could restart the operation in another city with another terrorist cell. I pursued Walsh through corridors filled with smoke and the sound of gunfire. The FBI assault had been swift and professional, but the terrorists were well armed and prepared for this contingency. Walsh reached a warehouse section of the facility where additional biological materials were stored. In his desperation to prevent the materials from falling into FBI hands, he had apparently decided to destroy everything. I watched in horror as Walsh activated some kind of incendiary device. Flames began spreading rapidly through the warehouse, threatening to destroy not only the biological agents, but also any evidence of the broader conspiracy. And that's how I found myself stumbling through the burning warehouse, with smoke so thick I could barely see my own hands. The sirens I'd heard were finally close enough to matter, but I still had maybe 30 seconds before the whole place came down. Behind a stack of burning boxes, I finally found what I was looking for. A wooden crate marked with shipping codes that would prove the connection between the Denver operation and terrorist cells in other cities. Detective Hawkins, who had been working with the FBI task force, appeared through the smoke. "Jake, we need to get out of here now." Together, we grabbed the crate and fought our way through the flames toward the exit. The wooden beams above us were creaking ominously, and I could feel the intense heat on my back as we ran. We emerged from the building just as a section of the roof collapsed behind us. The evidence we'd recovered would prove to be crucial in identifying and stopping terrorist cells in 11 other American cities. As dawn broke over Denver, the scale of what we'd prevented became clear. The FBI had arrested 43 individuals connected to the terrorist conspiracy and seized enough biological agents to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Agent McKenzie held a press conference announcing that a major terrorist plot had been thwarted, but she didn't mention my role or Maggie's contribution to the investigation. For security reasons, our involvement remained classified. I was reunited with Maggie at FBI headquarters, where she had been in protective custody during the raids. We were both shaken by how close the terrorists had come to succeeding, but relieved that the threat was over. Director Walsh and Agent Patterson were both in custody, along with most of their organization. Under interrogation, they revealed the locations of terrorist cells in other cities, allowing the FBI to prevent similar attacks across the country. Maggie and I spent the next several days giving detailed statements to federal investigators and helping them understand the full scope of the conspiracy we'd uncovered. 3 days after the raids, Agent McKenzie called me back to FBI headquarters for a final debriefing. She had information that would completely change how I understood everything that had happened. "Jake, there's something you need to know about this case," she said, sliding a classified file across the table to me. Director Walsh wasn't lying when he said there were foreign agents involved in developing biological weapons. The documents revealed that Walsh and his organization had originally been legitimate government contractors working on biological weapons defense, but they had been compromised and manipulated by foreign intelligence services who wanted to create chaos in American cities. The foreign agents didn't want to directly attack American cities, McKinsey explained. They wanted to manipulate American citizens into attacking their own country. Walsh and his people thought they were patriots saving America, but they were actually being used as weapons by our enemies. The complexity of the conspiracy was staggering. Foreign intelligence services had identified American citizens who were disillusioned with their government and gradually radicalized them into believing that domestic terrorism was patriotic. This case has opened up an investigation into similar manipulation operations across the country, McKinsey continued. Your work here may have prevented not just one terrorist attack, but dozens of them. A week later, I was back in my cramped office above Murphy's Diner, trying to return to some semblance of normal life. The insurance fraud cases that had once seemed so important now felt trivial after what I'd experienced. The news was full of reports about terrorist cells being arrested in cities across the country. The investigation that began with a mysterious night train in Denver had ultimately saved thousands of lives. I reflected on how the whole case had started with Maggie noticing something unusual during her night shift. It reminded me that sometimes the most important discoveries come from people who are just paying attention to their surroundings and asking questions when something doesn't seem right. Maggie stopped by my office that afternoon. She looked healthier than she had in weeks, now that the stress and fear of the investigation were over. Union Pacific has completely overhauled their security procedures, she told me. They've also offered me a promotion to lead the new security oversight program. I was genuinely happy for her. Maggie had shown tremendous courage in bringing the suspicious train to my attention, and she deserved recognition for her role in preventing a catastrophic attack. Jake, do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come to you that morning? Maggie asked. I had thought about it, and the alternative was terrifying. If Maggie hadn't noticed the unusual train, if she hadn't been brave enough to investigate, if we hadn't been persistent in the face of threats and intimidation, thousands of innocent people would have died. It makes me realize how important it is for ordinary citizens to stay vigilant, I said. The government has a lot of resources, but they can't see everything. Sometimes it takes people like us, just doing our jobs and paying attention, to notice when something's wrong. That evening, I took a walk through downtown Denver. The streets were full of people going about their normal lives. Families having dinner, couples on dates, friends meeting for drinks. None of them knew how close they'd come to disaster. I watched children playing in a park and thought about how different this scene would have looked if Walsh and his terrorist organization had succeeded. The biological agents they planned to deploy would have turned this vibrant city into a scene of unimaginable horror. As I sat on a park bench, watching the sunset over the Rocky Mountains, I thought about the lessons I'd learned from this experience. The most important one was that evil often succeeds not because good people are powerless to stop it, but because they fail to recognize it until it's too late. The people around me had no idea that their lives had been saved by a railroad supervisor who was curious about an unusual train and an insurance investigator who was willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Heroes, I realized, weren't necessarily people with badges and guns. Sometimes they were just ordinary citizens who refused to ignore their instincts when something didn't seem right. My phone buzzed with a notification about a new insurance fraud case, a routine matter involving some questionable shipping claims. Under normal circumstances, I might have groaned at the prospect of another tedious investigation. But after everything I'd experienced, I looked at that notification differently. You never know when a routine investigation might uncover something much more significant. Every case, no matter how mundane it seems, deserves your full attention and professional curiosity. I stood up from the park bench and walked back toward my office. I had work to do, and after the events of the past 2 weeks, I understood better than ever how important that work could be. 6 months later, my little insurance investigation office had grown considerably. The FBI had hired me as a consultant on cases involving transportation security, and my client base had expanded to include several major corporations and government agencies. The wall behind my desk now displayed several commendations from law enforcement agencies, as well as framed newspaper articles about the thwarted terrorist plot. I didn't display them for ego, I kept them as reminders of why the work I did mattered. Maggie stopped by regularly to update me on her new role as Union Pacific's Director of Security Operations. She had implemented new protocols that would make it much harder for unauthorized operations to use railroad infrastructure for illegal purposes. My computer screen showed several ongoing investigations, including 2 cases that had already uncovered smaller criminal conspiracies. The experience with the night train had taught me to look for patterns and connections that less experienced investigators might miss. The phone rang, and I found myself talking to a warehouse supervisor in Kansas City who had noticed some unusual activity during night shifts. The details were different, but something about his story reminded me of the conversation I'd had with Maggie 6 months earlier. I took detailed notes and asked probing questions, applying everything I'd learned from the Denver case. I couldn't be sure that this new case would turn out to be significant, but I wasn't going to take any chances. As I prepared to begin another investigation, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I was no longer just processing routine paperwork and filing reports. I was actively working to protect people from threats they didn't even know existed. The night train's secret had been revealed, and Denver's lost cargo had been recovered before it could claim any victims. But the real lesson of this story isn't about trains or biological weapons or government conspiracies. It's about the importance of ordinary people staying alert and asking questions when something doesn't seem right. Maggie O'Sullivan was just doing her job as a railroad supervisor when she noticed an unusual train. I was just doing my job as an insurance investigator when I agreed to help her look into it. Neither of us set out to be heroes or to save thousands of lives. We were just 2 people who refused to ignore our instincts when we encountered something that didn't make sense. The truth is, there are threats all around us that we never see because we're not paying attention. Criminals and terrorists count on our complacency. They count on us being too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to notice when something is wrong. So the next time you notice something unusual at your workplace, in your neighborhood, or in your community, don't just assume someone else will handle it. Ask questions. Report suspicious activity. Trust your instincts. Because sometimes the only thing standing between innocent people and disaster is an ordinary citizen who cares enough to pay attention and act on what they observe. And if you ever find yourself in a situation like the one I experienced, remember this: the truth is worth pursuing even when it's dangerous, even when people try to intimidate you, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against you. Because in the end, the security of our communities depends not just on law enforcement and government agencies, but on all of us working together to stay vigilant and protect each other. That's the story of how a mysterious night train led to uncovering the biggest domestic terrorism plot in Denver's history. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever noticed something suspicious at work or in your community that turned out to be more serious than it initially seemed? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you found this story as gripping as I did living through it, make sure to hit that subscribe button because I've got more incredible true stories of investigations that changed everything. Trust me, this is just the beginning. There are so many cases out there where ordinary people stumbled onto extraordinary secrets, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep your eyes open and stay curious. You never know what mystery might be hiding in plain sight.